Chapter 2, designing a program. I'm going to write some of this down on the whiteboard because I think it will just be easier to visualize, but we also have a fun graphic we might transport between this and the chair. I'm going to kind of do this live. So when you're designing a continuity program, there's a bunch of stuff you need to consider. So you need to look into costs associated with things, your timeline. There's a bunch of little things. Before I get into that, I'm going to kind of map out the different parts of it and then show you what the point of each part is in a cycle, so what this program is. And then you can think about, okay, what do I want to spend more money on? What do I want to spend less money on? Time, etc. How do I want to map this out? So I'm going to give you a view of what the thing is before you start just saying, okay, we have this budget for the thing. Okay, so the first thing that you're going to have is your program initiation. The idea behind your program initiation is you're mapping out what you're doing, you're scoping out the thing. This is what we're doing right now, really. So I'm referencing the thing while I'm doing the thing. Well, actually, before I get there, let's talk about scope. A lot of people don't know what scope is. So scope. Scope. Scope is an incredibly important concept that is used in project management, it's used in engineering, it's used all over the place. It is an incredibly important concept, and I have found that this actually is under-taught in a lot of university programs where it is critically necessary to understand. This is probably one of the most important concepts to get out of not most, but quite a few university degrees, especially going into professional environments. Scope. A scope is a lot like a lens, if you're playing a shooting game, like the sniper scope. It's the idea. Are you zooming in or are you zooming out? What does that mean? Okay, let's take a look at Walmart. Most people know what Walmart is. Actually, let's do a global organization. Let's do McDonald's. Okay, so we have McDonald's. There's different scopes of McDonald's. So we can go up in scope, or we come down in scope. We can kind of widen and narrow. So as we're widening up here, and narrowing down there, the broadest scope of McDonald's possible would be McDonald's Global. The narrowest scope of McDonald's here would probably be one task that one employee does. So the broader we get in scope with McDonald's, the closer we're getting to looking at McDonald's Global. If we were to do a plan, emergency whatever, for McDonald's Global, an individual death of an individual employee would not even show up on our radar. It would be irrelevant in scope. So think about the impact of one person dying to the entire population of the planet. So the impact of one death on the entirety of the human species. The scope is so large that even though that one impact may be very unfortunate and very sad, it's too small in comparison to the scope that we're talking about. If you're looking at McDonald's Global and you look at a $10,000 loss, it's nothing. It's negligible. Conversely, if we look at a one task, one employee, if there is a fatality of an employee at this scale, the scope is that employee. You're probably talking about a fatality of that employee, and that is catastrophic. That is, the entire scope has been obliterated, right? So the scope you're talking about when you start getting really big or really small, that this is the scale portion of it, is really, really relevant. When we start talking about the severity of the impacts, the amount of capital or money lost, the reputational impact, are 5 people injured? Has someone died? Like blah, blah, blah. The scope is going to dictate a lot how severe these things are. So you need to figure out what scope you're talking about before you start this process at all. It happens right here in program initiation. You have to figure this point out. Okay. That's one part of scope, figuring out where you are. So you could be McDonald's Global. You could be McDonald's National. So you could be you could be looking at the scope of all of McDonald's operations in France or in the United States or in Canada or whatever. You could be looking at all of the McDonald's operations in Japan, right? Here's another example. So Kentucky Fried Chicken, KFC. If you looked at Kentucky Fried Chicken's operations in Japan versus Kentucky Fried Chicken's operations in America, this is very different. In Japan, we're talking about a seasonal Christmas treat. In the United States of America, we're talking about something approximating more of a food staple. Like they're completely different scopes. Like these two, they're the same level, but the circumstances they're within has changed what you're doing. So you have this idea of the level that you're at, you have the context dependentness of this scope. You want to clearly define kind of what box you're playing in. And there are going to be things that are outside of this box, they're outside of scope, and there are going to be things that are inside the box that are in scope. And sometimes something is so small, it's still kind of outside the box. So you kind of figure out the boundaries of what you're playing in. It's going to be from this level to this level. Something in that is what I'm playing in. Everything that's outside of scope, I don't care. And it's not that you don't care ever, it's that you don't care in context. If you're trying to make a plan for stuff and your scope is too large, it takes too long to collect the information, and your process, your program just gets killed through the sheer volume of the amount of stuff you have to deal with. There's too much information. You can't get to the point of actually doing anything productive because you're just buried in data. So when you first do this, you want to usually have a pretty narrow scope. You want to have something be very specific. You could do, for example, McDonald's Global. You could do McDonald's Global, but if you do that, then you're probably going to say, I'm only going to do stuff that is going to affect me globally. Anything that affects me nationally, I don't care. So if there's an impact that hits Walmart Japan and only Japan, don't care. If there's a risk that hits McDonald's, like reputationally as a global entity, now I care. So you can have a really high level scope that's still narrow. You can kind of do this. So for example, something like geopolitical risk would be very relevant in global. Something like supply chain risk, if you're bringing across things from multiple countries. This would be less of a McDonald's thing, I would think, although I could be wrong. There'd be some degree, but they would source locally for food mostly. This would be supply chain risk for phone manufacturing because of the superconductors and the chips. That is a serious global risk you'd be looking at. So factories in multiple countries, right? But you get the idea here. So you have to figure out specifically what you're talking about. And then if you come across something that is out of scope, what you do is you basically say, okay, I have identified something that I want to think about that's out of scope. I'm going to, take a note. I'm going to take a note of that, record that for later, and then I'm going to deal with it later. When I do continuity again, be it in half a year, whatever, I'm going to see if I can expand my scope to include that. It's a special note. If you don't do this, then what will happen is you'll come across something that you go, oh no, I have to deal with this now, when you're halfway through the process. And by trying to deal with it when it's out of scope, you have now forced yourself to redo all of your work, when you were better off just finishing the process and then doing it again in another iteration and then including it. So instead of wasting all the work you've done, complete the work, do it quicker if need be, and then just do it again and include. So you can still gain the benefits from completing the entire process. Okay, with that note, I'm going to kind of erase this and go back to what that whole process is. We have program initiation. After program initiation, so you've kind of figured out your program, you've figured out the sort of budget you're going to have, what your scope is going to be, you're going to look through all that. You're going to get on to the next step, which is going to be, you're going to get into risk assessment. So you're going to do a risk assessment. Now, the risk assessment here is going to incorporate the disaster risk reduction stuff that we were talking about before in the previous section. And it's going to try to find those really simple, easy solutions that you can do quickly. This is also going to give you a really good understanding of kind of the breaking points of your business or your organization or your family unit or whatever. It'll give you a really, really good understanding of I call them thresholds or breakpoints, but some people have thought of these as tipping points. So the points at which past this point is basically a point of failure. You're going to have a really good understanding of, well, you know, this is what bad is, this is what kind of bad is, and this is what, oh no, it's all collapsing is. You get a really good kind of, it's usually quantifiable, it could even be qualifiable. You get a really good just overall understanding of something you've written down of what is bad. So you can compare. This helps you understand yourself really well. You can apply this to almost anything. It's kind of wild. Yes, I will probably have many videos on applying this to all sorts of really interesting and weird situations, and you're going to be very surprised just how far this tool can go into things that you would think it wouldn't normally go into. Really interesting stuff. Okay, you do that. After you do the risk assessment, you do something called a BIA. Now, a business impact assessment, a BIA, focuses primarily only on your vulnerability. The risk assessment will look at hazards and will look at vulnerability. It'll kind of incorporate both together, and it does hazard-specific or risk-specific analysis. So this will say, okay, I have a hurricane. What do I do? How do I deal with hurricane, right? So this is going to say, how do I deal with hurricane? This doesn't actually care what the hazard is. So this is something called all hazard planning, which I otherwise call like no hazard planning. There's this concept in disaster risk reduction and disaster risk management called all hazard planning. So you plan for something that works for any and all hazards. So for example, if I could do a plan to, you know, help myself deal with the risk of diabetes and the risk of heart attack and the risk of cancer and the risk of, and the risk of, and the risk of, that would be hazard specific planning. Or I could do an all hazard plan where I just focus on the vulnerable common denominator, which is my general body health. Now, I might not have as good of a targeted solution for one of those things in particular, but I know that if the vulnerable common denominator is my body health, then I can focus on that, and each one of those things is going to attack that anyways, and my issue is the way I'm vulnerable, so I'm fixing that problem. The BIA does that. So the BIA looks at how an organization or thing kind of operates and how it works. You kind of reverse engineer how to destroy it. And then through understanding how the thing gets destroyed, you can then target the vulnerability and then shore up that problem. So this doesn't care if it's a flood or if it's a fire. This just goes, how does my thing get destroyed? And how do I make that get undestroyed, basically. This also, though, is not going to directly give you solutions. This is just the analysis. The solution part comes next. So from this point, we're then going to have two things. Okay, so now after this, you're going to have incident response and continuity strategies. Okay? Incident response is your first 30 minutes. This is where that emergency management piece of being good at communicating and being good at dealing with an incident when it just happens really comes into play. That's going to be the first thing. You want to cover those first 30 minutes because if you don't do this, you don't get a chance to get to fixing your long-term problem. You have to not be dead to get the business operational. This part is very quick. It's fairly minor in terms of the amount of planning you have to do, but it is extraordinarily important. It is very, very, very important to actually make sure your evacuation is done correctly. For a lot of businesses, the reality is that if you spend all your time with the government auditing you or the police being interested in you because of potential negligence, you are not getting back in business. You are too busy dealing with multiple crises layered on top of each other, and you are not in this headspace of figuring out your long-term business strategy. You need to do this. Okay, it is critically important to do this. So, incident response is basically the first 30 minutes. In addition to incident response, the other thing you do simultaneously is these strategies. And this is basically your solutions section. So you've mapped out your program, you've identified risks within that said scope and everything, you've looked at what your other vulnerabilities would be in a more in-depth analysis, then you have your 30-minute solutions and your long-term solutions, basically. But this is your solution brainstorming section. The continuity strategies is going to be the bulk of your brainstorm. The incident response is going to be fairly quick. This one, there's a few priorities you kind of just have to cover. This one actually isn't that complicated. Most emergencies are very, very similar in the first 30 minutes. They have the same sorts of priorities. When very bad things happen, when an emergency happens, the commonality of it being an extreme situation actually makes a lot of the decision-making fairly straightforward. So that piece is kind of there. After this, you do both, and that feeds into plan development. Now, developing a plan is basically taking all this stuff and doing copy paste and then going, yeah, that looks about right. All of this stuff was your planning process. All this really is putting it together into a, okay, we know exactly what we're going to do. This is what we're going to write down, and then we're ready to send it out to people. Okay, this is very, very simple and straightforward. If this is the biggest part of your entire process, your priorities are completely off. Continuity strategies and/or the analysis part will probably be the bulk of what you're doing in the early part of this. Once again, this is copy paste. I'm going to show you a bunch of ways to very quickly grab from this, grab from this, grab from this, copy paste it in. You've already done the work. You're just figuring out what stuff you are or are not putting in the plan. It's very straightforward. Okay, so we have that. After plan development, there's a bunch of different names for this, but we have awareness training. You're doing the implementation. So this is, you've taken your plan, you've figured out what you're going to do. This is what we're doing because of all this. You have to put it into existence. You have to start implementing the thing. So awareness programs, this could be emails being sent out. Training, what are we going to train people on? What sort of things from this are people not going to automatically get? Are we going to have to run any drills, etc.? This is your planning part of, how are we getting this out there? So we have the plan, we have what we're going to do. How are we going to disseminate all of this? So you got to figure out how that's going to happen. You do that. There's a bunch of different things in there, but this is a component. If you write this plan, but you don't do anything with it, it's a waste of time. You have to implement the plan. You have to do something with it, or what was the point of making the plan? Okay. Test and/or exercise. After you've implemented this thing, you need to figure out if it works. You don't know if it works. You got to test it. Now, exercise means something very specific. So we're talking about something kind of like a more complex fire drill. There are ways, or if you've ever seen like a disaster exercise, like at an airport, where the plane is simulated crashed and then everybody comes in and figures out how to deal with that. That's like a large scale exercise. There's different types of tests and exercises, but the point is you have stuff that figures out if this actually works. So you've implemented your plan. Is it working as intended? So sometimes this is tested via a disaster or something happening, and there you go. Other times, more often, you want to run something so you can figure out if it actually works. Okay, after test exercise, you've got program maintenance / evaluation. Okay, you've done your test or your exercise that has figured out whether or not this stuff works. You have notes from this. You have the things you did before of, I wish we did that. I wish we considered that. That was out of scope. You have lessons learned is what we usually call this, or after action reports, or you have things that have told you what has happened because of this stuff. You should be taking notes of this and writing this down. You should be figuring out, okay, when we do this the next time, what do we do differently? How do we evolve on this thing? where does this go? There's a bunch of different pieces in here. There's a bunch of different ways to do this, but the point is you need to learn something from everything, or why have you been wasting your time? After that, you initiate a new cycle in the program. It just feeds back in, and you do it again and again and again and again forever. This is the once a year thing situation. This should be happening once a year at minimum. Once a year at minimum. At a minimum. Because as stated before, if you do this irregularly, if you do this not very often, then you've identified a risk that by the time you finish this, doesn't exist anymore or has changed to a point where this was all irrelevant. So you want to do this quickly, not perfectly. If you have a narrow scope and you do this quickly, you can just do it again and add something in. At least within the narrow scope that you set, the thing worked and you have useful information within that narrow thing that you've set. Okay? That is the general idea with program implementation. Now I'm going to start explaining to you some of the more fine details on some of the little things you want to consider, like costs and etc. when designing one of these programs. And we're going to magically transition away from Magical Lightboard. Woo!